This speaker series is part of the LDL as Data project funded by the Collections as Data team and Mellon Foundation funds. The goal of this project is to support the development and use of collections as data, particularly their capacity to serve underrepresented communities. What do we mean when we use the phrase collections as data? We're talking about using digital cultural heritage content, such as what's available on the LDL, digitized letters, maps, photos, etc., using that content in computational analysis. So text-heavy collections, you could perform text analysis on, digital mapping, that sort of thing. And we're part of a cohort within this greater project charged with creating examples of how to operationalize the datafication of our digital cultural heritage material. A little bit about our project team. I am Leah Powell-Duncan. I'm a disciplinary co-scholar on the team along with Elizabeth Kelly. I am focusing on users of the LDL within this project. So teachers, researchers, students, etc. Elizabeth, our other co-scholar, is focusing on LDL practitioners. So that's some of y'all. And thinking particularly about the ways in which we can evaluate how our collections are used and reused. Gina Costello is our administrative lead on the team. She's tasked with ensuring that the project remains relevant to and supported by the library. And we have SL Ziegler. They're our project lead, working on project management, focusing on logistics, outreach, promotion, keeping us all wrangled together. So like I said, our project is part of a large and diverse cohort of collections as data projects. We specifically are asking, what would it look like to offer all contents of the LDL as data? And we're thinking about this question sort of in two parts or two tracks. So there's the technology track, thinking about what technical features on the LDL site would make this feasible. So features like bulk download, machine readable rights statements, proper restriction rules. But I think what really makes our project stand out is our focus on community. We are invested in considering questions like, is this datafication something all 30+ members of our LDL community or LDL participants want? Is this something that's appropriate for all collections within the LDL? How can we as a group consider the ethical implications as well as the promise of collections as data at the LDL level? And we are tackling these questions through a set of LDL as Data project community deliverables. So we started earlier this year, at the very beginning of the year, with an intro survey to our LDL contributing institutions. Some of you may have answered that survey. It gathered information particularly about how LDL institutions select content for digitization. Then we held an intro meeting to discuss those results. We are currently developing some sample projects that demonstrate the type of research and teaching that can be done with our collections. These projects are currently taking the form of a set of video tutorials. One is focusing on text analysis and the other is focusing on digital mapping. Stay tuned for those. We, of course, are hosting this very speaker series. And depending on the state of the world in summer 2021, we hope to host an in-person LDL Institute where we could get together and really like concretize this dialogue in the same place. But we'll see if that is actually possible come May. And we'll wrap up the project with an intro survey. And of course, we will continue the community and dialogue that we've built throughout this year. The speaker series will continue through spring of 2021. We already have several speakers scheduled. Our next speaker is Dorothy Berry on the 22nd. We've got Tanya Sutherland coming up in November. She's going to be giving a talk entitled Making Culturally Responsive Decisions About Redescription in the Louisiana Digital Library. We've got Jessica Perkins-Smith in December giving a talk, Digitizing Mississippi, Black Voices and White Supremacy. And then we have more speakers coming up in December, January, and February. But today, we're hearing from Dr. Alex Torres. She is the program director at Humanities Amp. She has her PhD in English from LSU, and her work addresses the educational needs of undocumented adolescent English learners. Humanities Amp is an educational nonprofit that connects educators and students with community resources, instructional coaches, and a professional educator network. The Humanities Amp curriculum emphasizes community engagement, critical literacies, and culturally relevant education. I personally have been excited to build a partnership between the LDL and Humanities Amp because I'm so inspired by the work that they do in Louisiana public schools. And I hope our digital collections can serve as a resource for teachers in the state. And I know that we have a lot to learn from the community engagement that Humanities Amp focuses on. So with that, I will pass it off to Alex and her talk, Amplifying the LDL for Educators and Their Students. We should have some time at the end for some questions from all of you. So as questions pop up, feel free to either drop those in the chat or hang on to them. But dropping them in the chat would be ideal.
Thank you so much, Leah, for that introduction. It certainly is great to be here with you all. And just another quick note about Humanities Amped really started with two teachers trying to figure out how to make their classrooms amplified in terms of well-being, critical literacy, and civic-minded problem solving. And now we are across 5 different schools and serve 450 students with those methods in mind. We just believe that we can transform public schools from the inside out, and we really see that students are our next generation and current, in a lot of ways, our current leaders for our communities. So we want to make sure that their voices are centered and that their well-being is centered as well. Because of that, we also just have really great outcomes whenever students are given more agency in terms of the curriculum and the lessons that they are given, whenever they're centered as problem solvers, whenever we're giving lessons where they get to explore and be curious. Of course, we create a classroom space that is more welcoming, and as such, 29% are more likely to graduate. And even though we try not to do too much of an emphasis on standardized testing because of our approaches, they end up doing better on standardized tests than their peers that are not in the program. But I kind of just wanted to give y'all that context because in this talk today, I'm giving ideas for lesson plans that educators could use to explore the LDL in ways that are creative and fun and joyful. So not just as a research source, but as a way to kind of celebrate what's there and to kind of be inspired and to think critically about what is being stored in this LDL. We also want students to be able to not only read the word, but the world, so to speak, and be critical about the world and the context that they are in. So that's kind of just the way that I approached these lesson plans. Also, whenever we think about lesson plans, in our context, we think about 2 main things. The first layer being, is this going to be culturally and historically responsive? Are we really centering the child's identity development, their skill development, their intellectual development, and their criticality. So we're not just giving them something to memorize, but we're hopefully giving them material that's allowing them to think again critically about themselves, critically about the world, and really sneaking in the skill development in a way that is more authentic than here's a worksheet, do the worksheet, turn in the worksheet, get your grade, as opposed to doing some more deeper learning. The second layer that we also think in terms of being trauma-informed and healing-centered, we can't learn if we are too stressed out. We can't learn if we haven't processed what we need to be processing. And we can't learn if we don't feel safe in the space. So that's why our lesson plans and our curriculums focus on the safety, trustworthy and transparency, peer support, collaboration and mutuality, and empowerment, voice, and choice. Again, we don't think in the model of terms of the sage on the stage, but more of like a teacher is there to help facilitate knowledge, and students already have knowledge, so how do we tap into that? So that's kind of the context as looking at these lesson plans. And I'm presenting 3 different lesson plans, and then we're going to get to play with these lesson plans ourselves closer to the end. So one way for them to explore what we have in the LDL is through looking at the different collections of recipes. So we would ask the students a kind of pre-write discussion to get them thinking about what do they cook, who cooks in their family, what are some of their favorite recipes, just to get them in the mindset of thinking through recipes. And then you would present the LDL, and it's good to give them a context of what is a database and what it, beforehand, in terms of modeling for students how to log on, how to use the search bar. So while you do that, you can pull up this crawfish dip example that's in a Baton Rouge cookbook collection there. So you kind of just ask your students what stands out from this recipe, what's the title, and then after you model that process, you would ask them to find an artifact of their own. And once they have their own artifact, again, having them think critically, what year is this from, what might be the context, what's the title, what's standing out to them, and thinking of like, is this old enough that, you know, it might be challenging to find these ingredients in the store, or is it recent enough that you could go right now and pick out these recipes, right? So you want to have students be able to share their responses. So as they collect their artifacts, give some time for students to share what did they find, project what they find, kind of have a moment to think through and talk about what they found. And then to connect it to their own experiences, asking them to write their own recipe. And again, here is a lesson where if you have to think about what is required to write a recipe, right? You have to be able to give clear sequential directions, right? You have to think about how am I stating this, what first, what comes second, am I being clear? You also have to think about measurements. So this is also a way to introduce, if you're doing fractions, if you're doing a math, we could even use this in a math class to do kind of conversions, pounds to ounces, what is this? So it's also a way to like introduce other lessons. And again, you want to have them kind of share their responses, and at the end have a kind of closing reflection in terms of what did you learn about this activity? What did you get out of it, right? So all these skills are happening in a more organic, authentic way where students can kind of like see what's in the LDL, explore what's in the LDL, and practice some of these literacy skills. So this is one example. A second example A second example is on architecture. So you can have, what does your dream house look like in terms of what would you want, how many rooms, what special features, how does it make you feel? And then in a similar process, model what it would look like to go into the database and find what is there, right? And the LDL, the digital library, has all these beautiful partnerships with all these other libraries, right? So it naturally links you to other libraries and their collections, right? So again, prepping students for research without it being a softer introduction to that. So similarly, have them this time find a house or find a building. What's the link? What's the year from? What's the title? What stands out to you? Have them share out. And then a similar writing prompt that you could do there, and you can give them a choice. Write a story about the house from the house's perspective. Who lives there? What do they do? How many rooms? What do the rooms look like? So with that writing prompt, what you're also having students think critically about is point of view, right? So if you're having to embody a house, how is that a different perspective than if you're just talking about yourself? So if you're having to think about what it would be like to be this building or to be this house. And again, you're being inspired by the picture that you found in the LDL. Or you could give them the option of themselves, of like, what would happen if you lived in the house? What would your typical day look like? Who lives with you? What do they do? Are there pets? What does the room look like? What's your favorite room, right? Having them think about, especially if it's a picture from a different time period, having them think through historically, what might the people be doing at that time? What might I be doing? So a way for them to think critically, and also a way that teachers could introduce a unit on whatever historical period that they may be concentrating in. So if the history teacher is about to start a unit on the 1920s, might pull up a different collection that deals with the 1920s and be inspired from the architecture there. And then encouraging them to, again, end with a share out and a closing reflection. A way you could also expand this lesson plan in terms of, you could ask students to do sequential pictures. So find a house from the 1850s, then an 1860s, then 1870, 1880, and so on until present date, so they can see the different, how houses evolve across time, right? And have a discussion around that. And also, since I've taught English learners for a while, this is a lesson plan where you could easily use to introduce vocabulary about houses, about furniture, about landscaping, all kinds of way that you can get creative, again, focusing on what's in these archives. And then a final lesson plan that could happen is around animal studies. So the entry point there, the pre-write and discussion, is like, what is your relationship with animals? How do you interact with animals in your life? Do you have any pets? Are you afraid of certain animals? Which animals are your favorite? Again, having them start to think about how animals apply and their relationship with animals within their context. Once again, you model, you might use an example like we have here, women and their animals, to kind of like think through, what is this image telling us about the relationship between humans and other animals, right? Because humans are animals, so other animals. And you could even broach, is this artifact worth preserving, why or why not? And again, whenever you're analyzing images like that, it's good to look at like what's in the forefront of the picture, what's in the background, what kind of shades or shadowing is going on. And so what kind of action or lack of action is happening in the image. So you could have a rich discussion as students analyze this image. And then again, you ask them to search for an animal, and it could be a picture, or it could be a song. There's all sorts of wonderful things in the digital library, so they could again have fun looking through and exploring at a slower pace, a lower stakes pace that isn't necessarily find an essay or find something that like supports and that kind of research, but a softer entry point that's really emphasizing curiosity. And then having them likewise think about the relationship in the picture that they found. What is there, if there are humans in the same picture, what's the relationship there? And then the closing reflection, again, if we're focusing on the relationship between animals and humans, have them really think about that. So a lesson like this could easily help introduce animal studies, or if you're in a zoology class, you could do this. Or if you're thinking about ecology, or if you're thinking about post-humanism, this is an activity that could really start engaging with students' curiosity about such things. All right, so now it's our turn. So you're gonna take the next 8 minutes or so and kind of interact with one of these prompts. It really does not have to be perfect. You can choose one, you can combine them, you can write about whatever you want. You could either write a story about a house, again, from the house's perspective, who lives there, be very descriptive there, or as if you lived in the house and what would your typical day look like. You could also go and choose an animal artifact and think about the relationships there, or what the animal is doing in that image. Or you could, write a recipe for the next 8 minutes. So really up to you. So let us share out. Do we have anyone that is brave enough that would like to start us off? You can unmute yourself if you volunteer as tribute.
I'll go ahead and do it if nobody else is very eager. I was, compliments to whoever it was that came up with the slide deck examples. I'm particularly fond of the men holding 2 species of Louisiana crawfish. Slide 15 in the slide deck.
That was my favorite too.
For anybody who wants to take a look. And what I like about this, looking at your prompt, Alex, where we're invited to think about the relationship between the people and the people and the other animals. I don't get a sense that these 2 men knew they were going to do this today. They look a bit put out and not really dressed for crawfish handling. But I also think from a sort of a history of technology point of view, it's really interesting that this relies on a black and white photograph to show the different colors of the crawfish. So the caption here says that the red and white crawfish, the 2 most common species in Louisiana. And right, you can definitely tell they're the 2 different colors. I just thought it was very interesting that a black and white photo is showing that one of those is, meant to show that one of those is red. So I think that's sort of another angle that you could come to this with.
Thank you so much for sharing. Do we have any other people? Again, no pressure if you don't feel like sharing, but anyone else who would like to?
I don't mind sharing.
Okay, go ahead.
So I looked under the animal slides, and so I examined the photo, wolf playing with young girl in front of Edge Hill House. and really just sort of thought of some discussion points you could use to get started off with this. So, what stands out to me is the relationship between the human and the wolf, and the idea of, domesticating wild animals, because the metadata also sort of gives us some questions. It says that the wolf was captured as a few days old. How was he captured? Um, any sort of ethical implications about this. And also when the bond that's shown in that picture, the bond that we create with animals when we domesticate them, versus another slide under the animals, the children surrounded by farm animals, and compared to that, it shows a completely different relationship with the bond that those animals have. With the farm animals, every single animal there, has a purpose for the human's well-being, versus the domestication of the wolf. So I just thought, that comparison was interesting.
Thank you so much, Leah. Again, yeah, you can get so much rich discussion from the analysis of different images. So thank you for sharing. In the chat, someone pointed out that if asked if they could copy information in the chat or share in the chat. So yeah, if you also want to share in the chat, please do. We'll give you people a moment if they want to do that. Does anybody else want to share?
This wasn't specifically addressing one of your prompts, but I was reading the recipe for making bread from our WPA, our Works Progress Administration collection, and thinking about the way that recipe is written as sort of a process that you would do something at a certain time of day and then set it in a warm spot and then add a walnut-sized amount of lard, as opposed to recipes today that are so much more procedural, I guess, and sort of the different forms of knowledge that those represent as sort of like learned experiential knowledge versus a kind of step-by-step textbook knowledge.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. And then if y'all want to see what Charlie used, that you can link to that specific image. And he says that the photo tells me who Lucienne is, a human who lived at a studio in the woods and likely an artist of some kind, but not the name of the dog. This makes me wonder if there was an unnamed dog that was owned or loved by the general inhabitants of a studio in the woods, or one who always looked forward to the new visitors and who met hundreds of artists over their lifetime. The dog is hugging Lucienne and she is holding them back, and it is obvious that other people in the background are also enchanted. The dog looks like a family dog, the kind of lab that so many people want to adopt and care for. I wonder if they're happier being adopted by a community instead of a family, more room to roam, more people to meet, or if they would have chosen to be cared for by one family instead. So I wonder which one I would choose if I was a dog. Great questions. So again, these kinds of prompts are really having students think critically. They're having to use imagination. And again, they're doing the research process of going in to a digital library, doing the search at a more low stakes, less stressful kind of way. Any final thoughts before we move into kind of a reflection and close and question and answer? So any last takers who would want to share? All righty, thank you so much for those of you who shared, and let's go on then. So question, and we're going to open up the floor to any questions. Did anything stand out to you? What did you learn, or what new thoughts did you have? Again, or if you have general questions about these lesson plans, you can unmute yourself and ask, or if you want to use the chat, we can keep using the chat, whatever works for y'all.
Alex, I have a question.
Yes.
With the Humanities Amp, how did you go about getting into the classrooms? Did you go straight to the teachers, or did you go through the administration or something like that?
So it was kind of a combo. Now that we're at different schools, we have an instructional specialist, Destiny Cooper, who works within the school system. So she had set up meetings with principals, asking them if they had any teachers who they would nominate or who would think that they are a good fit for our approaches. Because yeah, you have to be a little bit more social justice oriented, open to having more kind of like restorative or healing centered practices. So yeah, you have to have a kind of teacher that's kind of open to kind of more innovative approaches to teaching. So yeah, so we talked to principals to nominate teachers.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Other questions? And thanks for coming, Sean, in the chat.
So yeah, hi Alex. I have a question. This was just fantastic. Thank you so much for this. And I'm wondering about, I guess to bring this back to the larger theme of the speaker series, where we're thinking about using the LDL collections as data. Do you have? I guess my question is, what would make? Is there anything about the LDL that could? Let me start again. You're now talking to people who spend a lot of time with the LDL, some of us here. Is there anything about the LDL that could make this easier for you as an educator with middle and high school students?
It's hard because it is very user friendly. From, you know, it has on the sidebar, if you want to narrow the search, it gives you these options. It gives you different ways to search. Excuse my ignorance if I don't know, but is there already like a video that helps walk through some of those search features?
From a user point of view, I don't think so yet. Would that be helpful?
I think so, because, you know, normally a teacher would model that for their students, right? So like would model, oh, we're gonna look for a recipe and go in, type in recipe and do that for them. Again, normally a good teacher would do that, but, you know, maybe if it's like an asynchronous class, or a class where the teacher can't do a live walkthrough, it might be good to have a video that it shows you those features. Yeah. But otherwise it makes sense, and it seems very accessible.
Maybe a similar question about developing LDL features and resources. We've developed some sort of educational resources around the LDL, subject guides, that sort of thing. And we sometimes come up with the question of if we should be aligning our resources with state student standards, like either in social studies or English. I'm wondering if you have a perspective on that. Like, does a resource alignment with the state standards make it much more approachable or usable for teachers, or not? Is it not something to worry that much about?
The ones that were on there, it certainly does help whenever a teacher is having to write a lesson plan and is having to justify the lesson plan and is saying which standards are being aligned and all that. It certainly is very useful to have that kind of information. Because again, you're just, different teachers are in different contexts, right? Like some have to justify their lesson plans in such a manner where it's very clear where those alignments are. And some might just, again, be wanting to have their students kind of explore and do more of like, this is learning for learning's sakes kind of a situation. But for those that need to have those standards, then it certainly is useful to have that for them. Charlie in the chat is piggybacking off of Scott's questions. Many of us are using search terms from the Library of Congress, subject headings, but there's a special subjects headings, vocabulary for children. Would it be useful for us to note certain collections which might be more useful for classroom use and include faceting terms designed for children? Yes, I think that the easier you can make it for teachers and students, that would be wonderful, to have that kind of, to make it super clear and noting that certain collections are here. I think, yeah, that would be great. Thank you. Other questions?
Will I get booed if I say I have more of a comment than a question?
Yeah.
I just want to say, like, and that's definitely something that we're thinking about with, as we try to think about the LDL as data, is how to make the data sets as useful as possible for classroom use, etc. I know that we, Leah and I earlier this year, it seems weird to say it because it seems so long ago, met with Humanities Amp educators to talk about some ways to use I guess data sets from the LDL as for education and students. And so I think it'd be really great to have your perspective, Alex, when actual data starts coming out of the LDL and being able to make sure that it's as usable for educators as possible, as easy to find, as easy to get out of the LDL and things like that. So I really appreciate this talk. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm glad, and thank you all so much, because yeah, just the wealth of material here, because again, there's the transcripts. So if you're teaching students how to conduct interviews for research purposes, there's so many interviews on there. There's transcripts of interviews, or there's the kind that there's already like digital recordings that you can listen to. That there's just so much material here that students can engage with. So yeah, making it clear, and maybe keep doing sets that you would think are useful or that you would find interesting. It's kind of just putting yourselves in the shoes of like a 12-year, what would a 12-year-old kind of want to see, or what would a 10th grader want to see? Unfortunately, in schools, we center currently too much on state testing, on a form of learning that takes the joy out of learning, and that is questionable in terms of, is it authentic or real kind of learning? So the more opportunities we have to engage with the world in a real, authentic kind of way, and right now that we don't have the world as accessible due to the pandemic, we can't leave, it's great to be able to like explore both like space but time in a digital library such as this, right? These images are really rich, but then again, there's like, I feel like I'm preaching to the choir, because what's in your collections, but it's like, I guess what I'm saying is like, what are you most excited about when you are in the collections, and like what do you think would spark that curiosity or that critical thinking in younger people?
In one of your lesson plans, I mean, when I'm thinking about creating resources, I'm thinking about questions like that. What sparks curiosity? What would be of interest at various age groups? One of your example lessons, you had the question, is this artifact worth preserving? Which I thought was interesting, because that sort of zooms out from what is the content of this artifact? What are we seeing here? What does this show us about history? To the kind of questions we're asking about assessing our digital collections and what we prioritize digitizing. I guess, again, this isn't so much a question as a comment, but it did make me think we do have sort of cross LDL downloadable data about the LDL, about the content of it, about the types of items and the institutions they come from. And maybe that type of data would be usable for younger learners, thinking about questions like, what do we prioritize making visible in our state and that sort of thing. I don't know if you have any comments on that, but that's just
yeah. I think it's also with these current generations that are in schools, right? Like they've never not been in a world where a phone could take a picture. So it's they're constantly also making those questions of like, do I keep this selfie? Do I save this meme? Do I share this thing, right? So I think that that could even be a different lesson plan that could be used in terms of like what is worth preserving and why, you know, and having them also think about like when they do save a selfie or a meme and they store it, what does that mean and why? And similarly, like why is it important to preserve some of the artifacts that are here? So yeah, I think it's a good way to make those connections and have them think critically about it. And then Morgan in the chat asks, do you think it would be useful for K-12 students and teachers if there was a view mode for collections that could turn off metadata? I'm thinking of how the slides had a presentation of the photo that was just the image. I'm wondering if it would be a useful feature for teachers to have an easy way for students to just explore the collections as images as a first entry point. Yeah, I think especially for younger ones, I would say maybe perhaps for like elementary school students or students with special learning needs where like it might be too distracting or too overstimulating to have some of the metadata, then for those kinds of accessibility purposes, I think that would be grand. But for middle school and high schoolers who at some point need to be introduced to research methods and using a database kind of format, I think for them, they need it. This is the entry point of like, no, let's practice searching things and narrowing down searches and stuff like that. But for younger ones, then yes, I think that would be really, really nifty. Cool. Other final thoughts or final comments or reflections? Thank y'all so much.
Thank you, Alex. I want to be respectful of everyone's time. I know we're coming up on 11 o'clock. Thank you all for joining us. I know this has got me thinking about ways we can make the LDL a little more hospitable to educators at various levels. I think this is a conversation we can continue within our LDL community. So yeah, thanks you for getting us started, Dr. Torres.
My pleasure. Again, it's an excellent teacher source as an educator, and just I always admire all the work that anyone related to libraries and digital collections. So thank y'all for all the work that y'all do.
All right, we can wrap up there. Hope everyone has a good day.
Bye, everybody.